level English language students need to be able to master what we call critical reading skills. This is particularly true of students who are looking to pursue higher education studies at an English-speaking university. Critical reading skills allow students to read between the lines, or to access the deeper layers of meaning that an author has put into his or her work. In this session, we'll take a look at these critical reading skills and also present activities to do with your students so that they can develop these skills for themselves. We start the session by contrasting surface reading and deep reading. In order to complete deep reading, students need critical reading skills. We then look at the sub-skills that go into the overall skill of critical reading. Then we look at each of these sub-skills in detail, including using context clues, identifying inference, fact, and opinion, identifying the author's main idea, pronoun referencing, and identifying the author's purpose. So let's get started. Most of the time when we're reading something, we read at a surface level. So we're usually just reading for specific pieces of information, or for enjoyment, or just to understand the gist of what the writer has written. However, when we are reading critically, we need to take it to a deeper level, and this is called, appropriately, deep reading. So to compare and contrast surface reading and deep reading, we've given you the chart in Activity 1. Let's take a look at this. In a surface approach to reading, the student intends to complete task requirements. The student memorizes the information needed for those requirements or for assignments. The student fails to distinguish principles or ideas from examples. And the student focuses on discrete elements in the reading, so just pieces of the reading, rather than synthesizing them or putting them all together to understand the big picture. And the student does not reflect on the writer's purpose. In a deep approach to reading, the student intends to fully understand what the author has written or the writer has written. The student interacts actively with the content in the reading text. The student relates new ideas to his or her previous experience. The student links concepts to everyday experiences. The student connects evidence to make conclusions. And the student analyzes the logic of the main argument or of the information that the author has written. In order to take a deep reading approach to a reading text, students need to apply what are called critical reading skills. Critical reading skills allow students to attack a piece of reading or a written text with a critical or evaluative eye. Within this overall concept of critical reading skills, there are sub-skills that are most important. So these include using context clues to determine the meanings of new words, making inferences and identifying inferences, fact, and opinion, identifying the author's main idea, making correct pronoun references, and finally identifying the author's purpose. When we identify the author's purpose, we can also uncover some of the author's biases. So we'll take a look at each of these sub-skills of critical reading in turn so that you can better understand what your students need to learn and activities you can use to get them there. Context clues are hints that an author gives a reader about the meanings of new or unusual words. A context clue can appear in the sentence in which that new word appears. It can be right after or right before the word. It can also be in the sentence before the word appears or in the sentence after the word appears. Learning to identify these context clues and use them to understand new words is a key critical reading skill that we need to give our students. There are 5 commonly used context clues that we need to teach our students to first identify and then use. The first of these is a synonym. A synonym is a word that means the same as the word presented in the text. So an author will often present the new word and then do a comma and then put the synonym right after that word. Here's an example. My daughter has been struggling in math, so I got her a tutor or a private teacher. The next type of context clue is an antonym. An antonym is a word or a set of words that means the opposite of the new word presented. And once again, an author can put these right in the sentence in which the new word is first presented. Here's an example. Although some people are churlish, others are polite, cheerful, and absolutely well-mannered. The next type of context clue is an explanation. The author provides a brief definition of the new word, either immediately following the word or in a sentence before or after the sentence in which the word is presented. Here's an example. She was so frugal that she refused to give her own sons the money they needed to buy school supplies. It truly upset her to give up any of her money. The next type of context clue is an example. So the author provides a specific example to illustrate the new word that's been presented. Here's an example of an example. His stamina is one of the reasons why he is very successful. He is able to work long hours with little rest. A final context clue that authors can use is punctuation. So they can set off a definition or an example or an explanation with a particular type of punctuation. For example, they can use a comma, which we've already seen. They can use a dash, a semicolon, a colon, or parentheses. Here's an example. He believes that the world population will stabilize, reach its top point, and then stay at that point, in brackets, at 8 to 10 billion people. We've given you a sample activity to use with your students to help them develop their skills at using context clues. This activity is under Activity 3 on your handout. In the activity, students are first asked to define a new word that's presented in a sentence. Then they're asked to identify the context clue or clues that they used in order to understand the meaning of that new word. The purpose of this activity is to make students conscious of the process of using context clues. The next critical reading skill that students need is the ability or the skill to identify inference, fact, and opinion. Let's start with inference. Inference is when we make a conclusion that something is probably true or probably correct based upon information that we acquired previously or information we already have. This information allows us to make this particular conclusion. Here's an example. So a reading text tells us that Susan had difficulty with her last patient of the day. The patient was complaining of sore muscles. So Susan said she could give him ibuprofen. However, the patient was not happy with this because the patient wanted Susan to fix his pain right away. So our inference here is that Susan is a doctor. How do we know this? Because we know that doctors work with patients, and we know that doctors are allowed to prescribe medication to patients. Here's a second example. I went out into my garden one spring, and I found it. And it was really weak and hardly breathing. So I called the vet, and the vet told me what to feed it, which I did. Several weeks later, it got stronger and stronger, and it started to hop around. And one day when I left my window open accidentally, it actually hopped out the window and left. And I never saw it again. So what is it? The text doesn't tell us, so we have to make an inference. So we're going to make a guess here, or make an inference, that it is a rabbit. And we can do this logically because we know that baby rabbits are born in the springtime, and they're very small when they're first born. And we also know that baby rabbits hop. So the information in the text that this animal is hopping helps us make the inference that it is a rabbit. The ability to make inferences is a key critical reading skill. Authors don't always tell us all of the information that we need. They purposely leave pieces out so that we have to do a little bit of brain work to figure out exactly what they intend. And this is what making inferences is all about, using our background knowledge and previous knowledge in order to figure out the author's true meaning. In addition to making inferences, students also need to be able to identify the difference between a fact and a non-fact. A fact is something that is true and that can be objectively and clearly proven. A non-fact is the opposite. It may not be true, and it cannot be objectively proven. Non-facts can be divided into inferences, which we've already talked about, and opinions. Opinions are beliefs or judgments that each person makes and then supports with a particular argument, and the opinion may or may not be true. Our students need to be able to separate or identify fact and non-fact, and then within non-fact, identify inference and opinion. It may seem obvious that we should be able to say, okay, this is a fact and this is a non-fact, but very clever writers can use different tools to cloud the difference between fact and non-fact. So our students need to be attuned to these different tools that writers use and to be able to clearly say this is true and it's a fact, and this is not necessarily true, may be true, but we can't objectively prove it. In Activity 4, we've given you a sample activity that you can use with your students to help them work on identifying fact and non-fact, and also identifying opinion versus inference. These activities simply list or provide different statements and paragraphs, and then they ask students to say, this is a fact, this is an inference, or this is an opinion. Students then become skilled at identifying the different tools that authors use to indicate fact, inference, and opinion. The next critical reading skill that we need to teach students is that of identifying the main ideas that the author is presenting. Quite often there is a single main idea in every paragraph that the author writes, and we need to teach students to identify those main ideas and pull them out. Usually the main idea is presented in the first sentence of a paragraph, but not always. Sometimes the author mixes it up a little. So sometimes the main idea will be found in the middle of the paragraph, and sometimes even at the end of the paragraph. Sometimes the author will not blatantly or obviously put the main idea in the paragraph at all. The reader then has to figure out what that main idea is. And the way we figure this out is to ask the question, what seems to be most important to the author in this particular paragraph? What words or concepts has the author repeated several times within the paragraph? We can then make a logical conclusion based on this evidence about what the main idea is. So we need to teach our students these strategies for identifying the main ideas in the paragraphs. In Activity 5 on your handout, we've given you a sample activity to use with students to help them identify the main ideas in paragraphs. So in these activities, we simply give students a paragraph, and then we ask them, what is the main idea of the paragraph? And then we ask them, what is the evidence that you found to support the fact that this is the main idea in the paragraph? Once again, we're making them very conscious of the process that they're going through in order to identify that main idea. The next critical thinking skill that students need to master is pronoun referencing. Remember that a pronoun is a word that replaces a noun that appeared previously in a sentence or in another sentence. The noun that's being replaced is called the antecedent. The antecedent and the pronoun have to match, and it has to be obvious to the reader, or the reader has to figure out which pronouns go with which antecedent. This is the concept of correct pronoun referencing. It's not quite as simple as it sounds. Pronoun referencing can get confusing if there's a lot of distance between the pronoun and the antecedent. So students might forget, or the reader might forget, what it was that came before that is now represented by the pronoun. The other way that pronoun referencing can get confusing is if there's several nouns before the pronoun. So then the student is actually not clear which antecedent that particular pronoun is referring to. Here's an example of very clear pronoun referencing. Sally left her office at 5 o'clock. So her very clearly refers to Sally because it occurs very close to the word Sally. So there's no ambiguity or no potential for misunderstanding here. Here's another example. Sally Chan moved to Montreal in 2007. She grew up in Calgary. It's still pretty clear what she, the pronoun, is referring to, because the antecedent, Sally Chan, is still not that far away. But it would be less clear if I had maybe two other sentences between those two sentences, and then there would be a lot of distance between the antecedent and the pronoun. Then the reader might not be quite as clear about what that pronoun is referring to. Here's another example of pronoun referencing, and this is an example of confusing pronoun referencing. Sally Chan moved to Montreal in 2007. So did Mary Smith. She grew up in Calgary. The readers don't know if she, the pronoun, is referring to the antecedent Sally or the antecedent Mary Smith. So readers simply don't know who that she is talking about. The final critical reading skill that we're going to look at is the skill of identifying the writer's purpose. Every writer or author is writing for a particular reason, and one of our jobs as a reader is to figure out what this reason is. Once we know why an author is writing something, we can then more critically evaluate what has been written. There are three main purposes that writers might have when they're writing something. One main purpose an author might have is simply to entertain. If we're reading something and we find ourselves smiling or laughing, probably the author's main purpose is to entertain. Another purpose an author might have is to persuade. If we're reading something and we find that the author is providing arguments or trying to convince us of something, and we find our opinion possibly shifting a little bit, then the author's main purpose is to persuade. The final main purpose an author might have is simply to inform. So if we're reading something and we find that there's lots of new information and lots of details that are very interesting to us, that's probably the author's main purpose, to inform. In Activity 7 on your handout, we've given you a sample activity to use with your students to help them identify the author's purpose. In the activity, students are first asked to read some paragraphs. For each paragraph, they are then asked to state the author's main purpose, or the author's purpose. Students are then asked to provide the evidence that led them to conclude that that was in fact the author's purpose. So for example, if students think the author's purpose was to entertain, the students need to provide information or evidence that the paragraph was indeed entertaining. Once our students have mastered these critical reading skills, they'll be able to take a deep approach to reading any text. Remember, a deep approach allows our students to uncover the layers of meaning that an author has put into his or her work. And this is where we want our students to get to. We want them to be able to fully appreciate everything that's within a reading text.